continue. It sure is. All right. Let's see. I'll just not sure which one I should pick here. Guess we'll find out. DTLV01 seems reasonable. Let's see what happens here. Or not. Let me just open up a different one. Building masses DTLV01. Okay, let me just do that. This is top view, so that's just a make 2D. And let me just rearrange some of the things on my screen here so I can get to layers a little easier. Okay. So I'm in layers. I'm just going to maybe expand this out a little bit and look at these names. So I'm going to take those make 2D layers and I'll just turn them all off. All right. You can see in this one I have things like buildings, parks, railways, blocks, sun, wind. It looks like I have some data on here that I've brought in. We'll do this with Grasshopper next week or the week after. We'll actually tell it exactly. We'll input weather data and our latitude location data. We can generate all of these sort of sun paths, and also we can look at prevailing winds and start to do some of these diagram graphics to talk about sun, wind, and light. Here's another thing. I think I was mapping something like sound levels, and so I made like this sort of height field based off of some sort of data I found. Sorry, this is on parallel view. I'm just going to turn this to perspective really quickly, so it looks a little less odd. And so, these were things I could bring into Illustrator, and then suddenly there's some sort of, height field graphic that's color coded based off its height. So you can sort of see like the red is the tallest and the loudest, or and the blue is the shortest and less distracting or whatever when it comes to that kind of stuff. And so I was mapping things like that on here as an example. So let me just turn that off. There's my buildings. Let's see. Colorized data scape. I call it a datascape. Well, that's fancy. All right. And it didn't turn off. It's still there, isn't it? We'll learn how to do this stuff in Grasshopper too, by the way. Railways, parks. Why is it on that layer? Oh, of course it is. All right, well, I'll just turn that layer off for now. All right, so this is an example of a file of downtown. There's actually I see I should have scale 1D that bad boy away from the sidewalk there. And it looks like this one as well and a few others. So anyway, what's interesting is that, let's see, maybe it's interesting. With this, now I can start to map things. I can start to map things either three-dimensionally in Rhino, or I can bring out the graphic of this and then start to draw things in Illustrator, right? So I can talk a little bit about both. First things first, this time I will create a new layer before I start to map data on this bad boy. I'll add it up and I'll say, I'll call this, what should I call this? I'm at a loss. I'll call this sound or noise sources, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and check mark that, right? So now everything I make that's brand new will be on that noise sources layer. I'm also going to change the color of that layer. I do that not because I really love these colors. I don't. But they're really high contrasty, so then I can sort of see what I'm doing and compare it to what I had before and make sure I'm not forgetting anything. So in this case, maybe I'll draw some spheres, right? If I go to the solids box, there's more than just cubes. There's also spheres and cones and cylinders, etc. And what I'm going to do, no matter where I move the zoom, it's always in the way. Let me go ahead and turn off my object snaps. I'll just disable them for a moment. So, I'm going to look at this and say, Slotzilla, I love Slotzilla, but it's going to be a source of noise. And that might be unwelcome noise at some point, right? And same with over here and other parts of Fremont Street and intersections there. Maybe there's something over by the jail. It's just, noisy. Beats me. Let's see. And I'll just sort of play some of these things, right? Seems like there's a bus station over here. It's noise and exhaust. There's something over here. Let's see. This is 3rd Street. There's festival grounds over here. Noise, right? Or great sounds if you're, if you like it, but I'll go ahead and select these. In fact, if I want to select all of these at once, right? Since I put them on their own layer, I can just go to the layer, right click and say, select all the objects on that layer. Gumball's on, I can just move them up in Z really quickly all together and just sort of eyeball it a bit. So they're all sort of hovering off the ground. Okay. That one's sort of engaged into the side of the building for some weird reason. And now we just made a bunch of spheres. Like, man, just imagine what MGM could have done with Rhino. Actually, they used Rhino and Revit and a little bit of CATIA. And interestingly, I know somebody that used to work at Populous right when they started designing that thing. And then one of the technician engineers that moved here just to help out with the construction of that thing lives right down the street from me. I met them at the dog park a couple months ago. So I don't know how much longer they'll be here, but interestingly, he was originally from Indiana and is a big Colts fan too. So there you go. Small.
You talking about the Park MGM?
No, the Sphere, the Madison Square Garden, MSG. Sorry, Madison Square Garden.
Yeah.
Yes.
Gotcha.
MSG, MGM.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get them mixed up half the time. Right. So, if I wanted to, I could then assign those certain colors. Let me see what this looks like when I actually hit the rendered mode. Not too bad. I have the sun on. I'm going to turn the sun off. That really bleaches things out. And I wonder if this is doing the Funky Town thing again. Let me just go and I'll just select 767 copy of technical. Let's see what that looks like. It's taking a minute. The technical mode takes a little while if you have lots of information because it's got to make all that curve information. And then what you'll see is that the line weights don't scale. So if you have lots and lots of lines and they're all like 5 point width, then they start to really like sort of darken things up, right? Okay. So now what I'm going to do is well, first of all, I should turn off those hidden lines because I don't really need them. But one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to select the noise sources. So that select everything on that layer again. I'm going to select those off. I want to make them a different material so they stand out. This is where I might sort of think about, well, what kind of color scheme I'm going to use for diagrams. I'm a real sucker for the CMYK sort of, just give a bright color, make sure they don't clash, or purposely make them clash so that nothing actually matches. You don't have to worry about matching things up later. So I see properties, I see layers, I see render settings. I don't see my materials palette. Let me see if I can right click on there. Oh, I can. So I can right click on here and I can say, let's show materials as well. And there's the materials, right? I'm just right clicking over here in this box. And I can put help on, display, box edit, lights. There's all kinds of things You can put the sun settings up if you want, whatever. It looks like I have several shaders that I've already made, including a magenta and a kind of a blue with a little bit of lavender and a yellow. Close to CMYK. I don't really see the cyan, but I'm not sure what these are. But it looks like I have a bunch of, oh, I remember this. These were all shaders from that grasshopper definition for the height field. Interesting. So I might just pick one of these. Or actually, I'll show you how to make a new one. So I'll go all the way down. You see this plus sign, create new material. I'll say, let's just use plaster. And plaster gives me like a sort of flat finish, not too glossy like a plastic. I can just change its color. I can just go to the color picker and I'll pick a nice bright cyan. Okay. Now I've made the shader and you can see it here and there's a preview of it. I can right click on it and say assign to the objects that are selected. And then these should update, right? So now I can sort of double check that, make sure that those spheres are actually showing up, and they are, right? Yay, all right. In Illustrator, I might then give these some sort of like halo effect, so it look like it's sort of dissipating with some concentric rings around it or a gradient. So let me just talk a little more about this. Let me set this to ISO, isometric. And I'm a real sucker for trying to get north to be kind of close to being up. So let me figure this out. I'm thinking maybe a southwest or southeast. Let's see which one. Let's try southwest. There are the railroad tracks. No. Oh yeah, there's Las Vegas Boulevard. Supposedly. Although the Ogden doesn't look too tall. I think maybe that was one of the taller buildings I turned off. Okay, yeah, so that'll work. I'll just zoom in on this. Right, I'm definitely going to adjust the line weights here. As soon as I figure this out. Okay, yeah, options. So I'm going to go back to my view display modes. What we did this morning, and I'll just go to this, and I'll go where I go to the place where I adjusted lines and the line weights. So I have 1, 2, 5. So 5 for a silhouette seems a bit extreme here. I'm going to turn these down. I'm going to turn hidden lines down to 0, so they disappear. I don't think those are necessary, and I'll go with 1 and 1 for the typical edges, maybe. Two for the silhouette. Why is this not letting me set this to 0? I don't understand. Should. Just means I don't want any line, but it keeps changing it to 1, which is annoying. Maybe that's the drawback to this. Darn. Well, okay, we'll just leave them. I don't care that much. You can see already that sort of cleaned things up. Some of the confusing sort of density of line work can really darken things up from time to time. So I'll leave it like this. Go ahead and export this out. So I'll go to View, pull down, Capture to File. And really, I would say, try these things out. Give yourself a shot at sort of having a couple of bases here. So I'm going to do one like this. And I'll call this Diagram 01 or something like that. Let's just try that. Diagram 01. Save it to my desktop and hit save. However, I am going to do a make 2D of this as well. Okay. And the reason I want to do that is because, in fact, I'm just going to delete all of these layers here that are already up. Delete layers. Yes to all. 9,000 objects in those layers. Wow. Okay. Not anymore. Feels good. Kind of cathartic, like spring cleaning, but a little later. So I'm going to do make 2D. Oh, I'm going to turn off the noise source things first, actually. Let me do that. Turn that layer off. And I'll do make 2D as a base drawing that I can then put into Illustrator as well. And we can try several different things in Illustrator. Anybody use Illustrator a lot? Alex is okay, so Alex raises his hand. He's what about you,
I've
Dina?
used I've used Illustrator and I've also used have you heard of like the Affinity Suite by any chance?
The Affinity Suite. Which one's that?
It's like Photoshop. They have Photoshop, Illustrator, and like InDesign.
InDesign. Yeah.
It's like a one-time payment. And so
Oh,
it's
okay.
a
Oh,
lot of
wow.
people,
Okay. Awesome.
but I've used both. Like I know how to
Yeah.
use both.
You know Illustrator. Okay, good. All right. Excellent. Okay, so here I'm going to say no hidden lines. I'll use tangent. I'll keep the scene silhouette. Actually, you know what? I'll just turn the scene silhouette off. This is so large. I don't know if I really need it. Let's see. Viewport rectangle. I'll leave that on just in case we want it. So outside of the parallel view. Okay. All right. So remember, it's going to, on the top view in the XY plane, it's going to make a flattened drawing of this, just like this, just lines and curves. It's taking a minute, so I don't know why it's really taking that long. I don't think it really should. Okay, there, it's finally finished. Kind of interesting to look at a flattened thing in Axon, like kind of weird over here. But I'm gonna go ahead and move that away from the XY plane so it doesn't overlap with our model here. Just move that away. And one really nice thing about Rhino is that it likes Illustrator. You can basically export native Illustrator files out. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and select all this stuff. It's all in different layers. So there's visible curves, tangent curves, viewport rectangle. Those are all in different layers. And we'll go ahead and export selected. I'll put that also on my Mac desktop here. And instead of save in type like Rhino7.3dm, you can see there's a lot of different selection or choices here. I'll just pick the .ai, the Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator. And I'll call this site base axon for like DTLV. All right. I'm just going to leave it at that. Hit save. It might come up with a box, snapshot of current view versus preserved model scale. As a diagram, I'm not worried about scale at this point, but we'll talk about that later when we do some sections and things like that. Let's see, snapshot of current view. I'll just leave that. I don't care about RGB versus CMYK at the moment. Yep. So hit OK. And it said a file was successfully saved. Okay, good. All right, so I'm just going to save this really quickly here. Use Rhino 7. And while that's going, I'm just going to open up Illustrator. All right. So let me just first start by opening site-based Axon. It's exciting because at some point we'll take our 767 planar compositions and start putting them on the sites. I mean, you guys figured that's probably where we're going at some point, right? And then you have to like make all kinds of changes, or you take the same kit of parts and then start to respond to the site and start to build something up, right? So it's kind of up to you, and it's not a linear flow. It doesn't have to be, right? That's the nice thing about design. It's a sort of cyclical thing, and sometimes you have to figure out how you don't want to do it before you figure out how you do want to do it. I say just embrace that. Never have more freedom than you do right now in school. Certainly, time-wise, you don't have as much freedom when you're out in the real world. All right, so I just turned that viewport window off. You can see in my layers in Illustrator, right, I have the same make 2D viewport rectangle, make 2D visible tangents, make 2D visible curves. I don't think there's even anything on the tangents layer, so I'll just go ahead and delete that. So it's out of the way. I'm going to add another layer and we'll call this sound graphics. All right, so first and foremost, since I made an Illustrator file with a bunch of lines in Rhino, my Illustrator file is a bunch of lines in Illustrator. And so some of these lines we might want, some of these lines we might not want. But just like we can change the line weights or line widths in Rhino, we can do the exact same thing in Illustrator. So really quickly, let me just make sure that's docked in the right place. There we go. I have a toolbar on the left-hand side. I have a series of boxes that I can toggle on or off on the right-hand side. I have some settings along the top. The reason why I have that is I went to Window, Workspace, Essentials Classic, which is the interface I like the best. You can always go with Essentials, you can do all these things and look and see which ones you like the best. Essentials Classic sort of docks all the things on the right that I want and had put some settings on the top that I'm used to having there. And so I like that a lot for whatever reason. It's just the one that stuck with me. So we have things like color swatches where we can add colors and do things. We have symbols and patterns and things like that. Here where we see a bunch of lines and they go from thin to thick, that's called stroke, right? So in Illustrator, we have fills and we have strokes. So when we have a shape, we can fill in the inside, right, with a fill. And then we also have the outline of it, which is the stroke, right? Or lines or curves, right? And so when we go to stroke, it's literally talking about lines, and there's line weight. We can see we have a stroke weight, right? We can go anywhere from 0.001 all the way up to 100 or more in point, which seems a little weird. We can tell it to do a dash line or start to change the line type. We can give it endpoints like arrowheads and things like that, or little leaders and things like that when we want to sort of annotate something. We can tell it how to handle corners and how to handle center lines, etc. So anyway, that's that. We'll get to those details in a minute when we start to adjust things. But we have two selections over here at the cursors. So one selects a whole item, like let's say a line, right? And you can see that it puts a box around a bounding box around the line with handles that I can then rotate or scale or move. Okay. If I use the other selection tool, you can see that it wants to select some of the parts of that line, like the endpoint, for instance, and I can start to move the endpoints around. So there's always a difference between the main selection tool that's filled with black and then the secondary selection tool that's filled with white, right? The white one, you have to be very careful with, right? Because it wants to select control points, edit points, and things like that, but, parts of the geometry rather than just the whole geometries. And so I'm just going to select all of these things at once, right? You notice I have some blue lines and some black lines. I just want to make them all black at once, right? So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my color swatches, which is strikingly bare. That's weird. I'm not sure why. I'll just list it as, make a list here. I can always load more and I can always add some, but I'm not quite sure. Show color swatches. Show all swatches. Open swatch library. See if there's a default that actually has like some good ones here. Let's see. I guess not. Swatch libraries menu. There it is. Textiles, metal, nature. I'm trying to be like too picky here. Let's go with some bright colors. Yeah, why not? Okay, sure. All right, so here we have some swatches. I'm going to go ahead and select all these things. And you can see over here that I have two color swatches, right? And one is the fill, and it's saying that there's no fill. It's set to no fill. You can see there's a red line through it. It's basically saying no color at all, right? None over here. And then I have the stroke or the outline color. And you can see that it's saying, well, you've selected things with multiple colors. There's some blue lines and some black lines. So we're just going to show you some question marks. And if I just want to say, let's just make them all black, I can, right? Or let's just make them all orange, I can. Now, please don't make them all orange. That's just makes my teeth hurt looking at it, so colorful. But there it is, right? And so that's how I can start to change colors. For every shape, there's a fill and there's a stroke, and I can change them over here, right? And that's why I'm recording this. If you don't really remember exactly all these details the first time around, I totally understand. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and move these brights. Let's see here. I have swatches over here. I'm just going to move these over here as another tab. There we go. And always customize your interface as much as you want usually in these programs and make them truly useful. So let's go to the stroke properties and let's look at these. I can turn down the stroke weight to, like, let's say 0.5, right? Now it got a lot thinner, or 0.25. Now it's lighter. I think I can go, I think I've used like 0.001 before. Back in the old days when they first came out with laser cutters and they were just using these, so you can see how much lighter it is with 0.001 compared to, let's say, something ridiculous like 8. Where it looks like we took a big Sharpie or an unsharpened crayon and just started wailing away at this thing. So let's go to 0.5 and let's just leave it there for the time being. All right, so I have a black and white line drawing. I'm going to go to my layers here, and I'm just going to lock this layer that make the visible curves, right? So now all of my line work is here, but it's just locked, so I can't accidentally select it, can't accidentally drag it, I can't accidentally delete something or move it, right? Which is just fine with me. And I'm just going to click the circle over here and try to make the sound graphics my, oops, I don't want to put a lock there. I want to make it my active layer, all right? And let's just do this something similar to what we did. I'm going to go over here. You can see I have the same sort of setup, curves, shapes, and then some things that I can do to modify things as I draw. Here's the shape tool. I'm just going to make an ellipse. Of course, a circle is an ellipse, but with equal length and height. So if I hold down Shift, I can actually maintain a circular, what would you call it? A circular shape, right? Circular proportion. Then go to the cursor, and I just want to I'm going to zoom in here a little bit and move this around. All right, it's on the sound graphics layer. And instead of adding an outline, I'm going to make it a fill. And I'm going to go over here and I'll try to find a bright really quickly to just sort of look at. And I'm just really want to, it looks like Viva Magenta. That's the Pantone color of the year last year. Sort of a magenta with a little red to it. Yeah, maybe this one's a little closer. Yeah, that's Viva Magenta. All right, anyway. At this point, I can just copy and paste these things so they're all about the same size. Or maybe I make size relative to how much noise I think is coming out, right? So there's a little bit of noise from the street over here in a quiet area. There's a lot more noise over here on Fremont Street, let's say, or over by the festival grounds on 3rd Street, between 3rd Street and Casino Center or whatever. So let's make a bigger circle there. Let's make some big circles along Fremont Street. I'm just pasting these, oops. And then I'm just sort of moving them around. So copy and paste. I'm not really too worried about including them with the buildings yet, right? I can get to that detail later. Let's see. Let's see. So this is Fremont Street. This is Las Vegas Boulevard. So Las Vegas Boulevard, some of these intersections might have some honking car horns and things like that. I'm thinking about, there's some clubs over, whatever. I don't know. I don't really go to downtown Las Vegas to party that often because I'm old, decrepit. All right. Enough of that. Copy. So I can paste some of these smaller ones around. And here we go. It's really annoying. All right. So I'll just drag a few of these around. Suffice to say. And there's different ways you could do this. But one way I could think about this is then making a copy. And then there's a special paste. If I just do a regular paste, like Command V or Control V, it'll put it in the center of the screen. Let me just look at this, but I can do a paste in place. I think it's Shift, in this case, Command V. Ah, yes, there it is. Not only that, but I can then make it a little larger in both directions. And I can set it to just be the outline, right? And I could copy that and then paste and place that one. And do something like that. And then I can have these fade, a little bit. So then I can say the opacity for this one is 50%. The opacity for this one is 75%. And then I'll do one more, copy, paste in place. And I'll make that 25%. Right. So there sort of looks like it's sound that's dissipating over time or something, right? And so I could begin to sort of develop a graphic language for diagramming in Illustrator. And of course, at some point, I'd probably come back through here and start to make some more shapes. So here's where I might actually use my pen tool. Just so I can make a shape that's closed as white. And where is that? There is no white. Oh, I'll just make one. Turn up red, turn up green, turn up blue. We have white. All right. Fantastic. Right. And then I'd put that behind the line work and the layers. And so it's just trying to sort of make it look like this stuff is situated in a three-dimensional environment. Or maybe I don't really care for that. There's a way to do a different type of fill than a solid fill. So if I look over here, there's solid fills and there's gradients, right? So I have the fill selected because I could also make a gradient for the stroke if I wanted to. Really complicated. And there's gradient types. When you come over here, it automatically brings up the gradient settings. So I could do a radial gradient. That seems switched to me. Like I maybe want to do the dark in the center and let it dissipate out to nothing. Opacity 0 at the end. How do I get rid of this stupid gradient slider? No. This is not what I wanted. But sorry, I just keep, oh, here it is. There we go. All right, that's so much better. Okay. And then for this color, I should have changed the color to start with. Let's see if I can do that after the fact. I believe I can. Oh, that's the automatic switcheroo. So I should have done that beforehand. And then where did did I actually delete my circle? Oh boy. Easily the most dangerous thing is me trying to wield this software somehow. I'm not sure why this is doing this to me. Shows you how often I use gradients in Illustrator. Not very often, but hey, edit the gradient. Oh, here it is. Sorry. The fill was set to this, and I can set it to this color. Ah, there we go. Right. So, oops. And you can see that there's actually a gradient sort of thing. You can sort of manually do it here visually if you don't like this interface here. And set the outer limit, make it a larger circle. Draw that gradient in the inside. So maybe that's another way of sort of giving some sort of, you know, thing there, right? Thing there. Another way of sort of mapping things and making them feel like they're, you know, part of the larger whole. Let's see here. You can also start to make your own drawings in Illustrator. For instance, I think about the, like, you know, the sort of pins that are sort of ubiquitous now with mapping apps. So if I made not a come on. Not a gradient with pink, but let's see here. If I change this, maybe I'm just doing this the hard way. Here's what I normally do. I go to Safari, Google, vector map pins. I go to images and I would just find one that I like, download it, and then pop it in, right? You can see that, you know, there's others that are you know, editable, or you could trace it if you wanted to make your own. I wonder if there's actually they're actually in the symbols now. We have arrows, 3D symbols. You have to be careful with these symbols. You can get some really crappy things here, right? I mean, web icons. Well, these are kind of interesting. I actually like those in a retro kind of way. They're quite nice. Like that clock is bitching. Look at that wrench. All right, so text bubble. Let's see if they have anything in here that's worth looking at. 3D symbols. Ooh, yeah, don't use any of those. Those are awful. Yeah, never put a sun on a drawing that looks like that ever. Ugh. Yeah, same with these arrows. These arrows are not good. Sorry, I'm being such a snob. Web buttons and bar, other library. Grime, vector. I'm almost surprised or afraid to look. Oh, just like grime, grit. All right, well, whatever. If I simply go here and try to find a PNG or SVG or transparent background one. Yeah, here we go. PNG kit. I like something simple, but we could also draw this easier in Rhino if we wanted to, or you could just simply make a V off the circle. Transparent background. I just want one that's free. Free. That's the key. I don't want to pay for any of this stuff. Come on. There's a variety here. Let's see if Vecteezy actually lets us download it for free or not. Oh, interestingly, it doesn't say free on this one. Pro download. You got to pay for Pro and then no attributions required after that. All right. When in doubt, let's see. This is what being old and remembering how to actually design web pages comes in handy. So show web inspector. Let's just find this image that's being displayed right here. I mean, come on. It's not, this isn't rocket science. Why is my right click not working? Oh, this is so bad. Come on. There we go. Really? If I just, no, for some reason my cursor is not working. That's really odd. Oh, there we go. Save image downloads. Hey, all right. Not sure what's going on here, but maybe I have too many things open all at once. Beats me. Of course, let's just place that and see if it actually has a transparent background or if it looked like it was a JPEG. So the transparent background sort of grid was probably just a flattened grid that actually has a background to it. Let me just put it downloads and pull that up. Yeah, that's ridiculously large. Okay. Scale this thing down quite a bit. I like them. I don't like them that much. Okay. So here's an interesting thing we can do. Rather than tracing them, I could do a live trace, image trace. And make. Now, the default is, let's go with just silhouettes. Right, so I just made a live paint group, or sorry, image trace group. Now I can just expand it out. And probably ungroup it or something. Oh yeah, look at that. So if I wanted to do something like that, I could. Let's say I just want to copy and paste this around and start calling out bus stops for RTC, you know. Of course, I could select all of these and then give them a different fill color. Because that's what I do, apparently. All right. All right. This is starting to look a little brighter, at least. Right. So those are some of the things at your disposal, right? When it comes to Illustrator, you can start to just map these things on here. And that's what I'd encourage you to do. But think about, you know, these as diagrams that will make it into your final presentation, right? So it's not like you just start with like, we looked at downtown, you just tell us what you did, and then you just show us what you came up with, right? You tell a story graphically, how you're thinking about downtown, what you mapped, how that began to inform your design decision making, your conceptual idea, and then how that began to feed into your decision making as you start to shape this thing, right? So this will very much be a part of your presentation, your final presentation at the end, is to have these. You can do a fill and a outline or stroke at the same time, right? So let me go ahead and add a stroke color to it. Tone that down just a little bit, maybe 0.5 or something, so they pop out a little more. Add a stroke color, turn the stroke weight down to 0.5, right? And so you can start to, you know, begin to, and I think the key is to make these things really pop, right? So you start to see them, you know, and they're clear. They don't make more questions than they answer. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure if I'm really doing that here or not. But hopefully that's somewhat helpful. You know, maybe I'll make this the same, oops. The same gradient over here with the, you know, or maybe not, doesn't look so good. But so you can begin to sort of map these things on here. And look, if you're having a hard time with this, coincidentally, I am too, for whatever reason, I'm not sure why. Then you know, there's ways to get around that, and we'll talk about those later. So don't worry, don't let that get you from just sort of placing information on these things and keeping those things organized on layers, right? So you know, for instance, with these, I probably should have made a new layer. So I call these public transportation nodes. And I'll select these things really quickly. You can see right now there's this green box saying they're in sound graphics. So I move that up. Now I put them on public transportation nodes, which isn't the most most intuitive thing when it comes to, you know, Illustrator with layers compared to, let's say, Rhino or an AutoCAD or something like that. I could turn those off versus these independently, right? All right, so there's that, maybe you develop a set of these, but then the colors are the things that sort of define, this is public space. These are businesses, this is parking, and this color is public transportation stops or something like that. Of course, if you put too many things on one map, then you can't really read it, you know what I mean? So you got to sort of understand that too. That way, if you keep things on different, that's why if you keep things on different layers, you can always turn layers on and off and then publish these things out as PDFs with certain things on and off, right? But I wanted to sort of go through that workflow and just get it out there, right? Try it. And then, if you need help between now and Thursday, right? You miss a step, nothing's working or something's wrong, then on Thursday we can troubleshoot it. Okay. So I did want to sort of bring that up, and I wanted you guys to try this sooner rather than later when it comes to sort of producing these things. So when it comes to diagrams, let me do site analysis diagrams, right? There's lots of different ways you could think about site analysis. And of course, when I learned, we were doing things like this with Prismacolor markers and fine liner ink pens and things like that, right? There was these nodes called asterisks, and there's a particular way that came from 1970s landscape graphics, actually. And it's pretty interesting, but it's not necessarily something I'm interested in trying to recreate in a different medium. Let me find some good examples here. I thought I had some. Let me just sorry, there's too many things on my darn screen right now. Let's see here. It's always Zoom in the way. All right, there's the magnifying glass. I maybe just have a folder or a quick PDF. Okay, yeah, I can use this one. Why not? All right, can you guys see this PDF? Remind me at the end, and I can maybe post this as an example, some of these examples on Canvas for you guys as well. So here's an example of making some design moves with massing, right? So this is a famous example from an architect named Bjarke Ingels. He's a Danish architect, and so what he had to do at housing in somewhere in Netherlands. He had housing, he had parking, so he decided, let's put the housing on top of the parking, let's slope it and make a mountain, let's zigzag it to help frame certain directions of views. Let's make the parking ramp underneath something that goes upwards. Then let's cover it with a big facade that we can hire an artist to do some sort of public artwork on. Oops. Then let's take the layer of housing and subdivide it with the grid and units, and let's sort of make them as these sort of voxels that sort of stack and cascade, so that my unit opens up onto the roof of the adjacent neighbor's roof as garden space or patio space. So everybody gets a sort of yard, but in a sort of dense, another Danish sort of style of creating some sort of landscape and what otherwise is a flat country that's actually under sea level, right? So that sort of thing, step by step, sort of talking about how these things are generated, so you can begin to talk about the logic underpinning them, right? Why decisions were made and what happens, what good stuff happens when you do each one, right? So suddenly, if I live up here, I'm probably parking up here, and if I live down here, probably parking down here, right? And in fact, that's how they're numbered, right? Is sort of a new main street that sort of zigzags as a switchback parking ramp, that then feeds into each of these units. Or there's the traditional ways thinking about, we didn't talk about this, but in plan view, right, you could also begin to sort of map and colorize things in Illustrator, right? You can draw your own shapes in Rhino, and then fill them in Illustrator, or just draw them in Illustrator if you want, right? So you can certainly see that there's, basically a bunch of vector shapes filled in with with colors, and then you set the colors down a little bit in transparency so you can still see some of that street grid underneath, right? We can see what looks like parts of Manhattan and Long Island, and is this Staten Island? I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's Staten Island, and there's New Jersey over here, Hoboken somewhere over in this area, right? So, all right, so let's see. There's ways to think about this. Is an interesting diagram. And it's not something that you necessarily need to think about right now, but it was about the city and program and activities, right? So this is actually a really famous diagram from a famous design competition for a city in Japan, Yokohama, done by an office called OMA, or that's short for Office of Metropolitan Architecture. The founder of which is named Rem Koolhaas. It's a really famous architect. This really sort of skinny, shaved Danish dude that never smiles, whatever. Very, very Hans and Franz like. All right, different types of diagrams. So let's take a look, right? Again, they don't have to be complicated, right? I encourage you to keep a pen and a sketchbook or paper by you at all times so you can begin to doodle these things, right? This is a very famous example from postmodernism, right? From the 70s and 80s. This is Robert Venturi. Bob Venturi, and Denise Scott Brown, his partner, actually did a really famous book about Las Vegas. They were teaching at Yale at the time, and everybody thought they were crazy at the time, but they did a whole set of studios and research on the phenomenon of Las Vegas. And they wrote the book Learning from Las Vegas, and it sort of, I think, radically changed the sort of how Las Vegas was thought of architecturally as one that could actually be studied with rigor, but is different and unique compared to, let's say, a Manhattan or Los Angeles or Houston or Chicago, certainly, those sorts of cities. But what you see here are just simply a set of quick sketches, right? And it's sort of partie, right? It's sort of, here's the idea. We take a box, we cut it, we can cut it this way, we can cut it that way. When we cut it this way, we create an opening, we can push things through it. Let's make some sort of entrance, right? Or some sort of threshold, some sort of gate, right? And then you can see here the result, which uses a bunch of references to historical orders, but completely misuses them in weird ways, almost as a tongue-in-cheek joke, right? This was a house for Bob Venturi's mother, and it must be nice to grow up independently wealthy so your mother can commission you in order to help make you famous after you get out of school. I don't have such luck in life. I feel like I won the lottery just being, a citizen of the United States. I guess I feel like, we're, and as far as the world goes, we're, citizens of the world. We're pretty lucky when it comes to sort of wealth per capita, but certainly not the part of the 1% in the United States like Bob Venturi was, apparently. So you can think about diagrams when it comes to ordering systems, right? We talked about this before. Here are floor plans, simplified floor plans of very famous architectural precedents. So here we have an Egyptian temple, right? Here we have a Gothic cathedral en français. Here we have a very famous, what's the Baker House? I think it was like a medical facility or something by Alvar Aalto, probably somewhere in Scandinavia, because that guy's Alvar Aalto, and he did a lot of things in Sweden and Norway, right? But you can also start to understand, here we have a box within a box. Here we have a radial configuration. Here we have the sort of circle inside something that's rigid and Cartesian, right? So you can begin to sort of see the difference between sort of talking about exterior versus interior, right? Is it one big central space with lots of pochette that's filled in? Is it a space within a space nested inside? Is it a set of spaces inside a larger space, right? how do we travel through these? You know, we could talk about it as a radial configuration. We always go to central space and then go out in hubs or spokes, right? Hub spoke configuration, or we could think about it as a string of pearls where we move them in a linear fashion and we just, you know, come to each event in a one by one, right? So we can think about these in a number of different ways. They don't have to be complicated to start with. Think about it as your thoughts on paper, right? And don't be afraid about whether it's great or good or stupid, right? Just do it, okay? Right? And other ways of thinking about, again, the organization ordering. So here's relationships between inside and outside. Again, sort of whole set of diagrams talking about, you know, how do I move from out to in or from in to out, right? You know, there's this sort of figure ground paradox, right? Where it's like, is it these spaces or is it the cruciform and you know, in between, the sort of connective tissue, right? So you can begin to sort of think about a set of glyphs or a set of sketches that help you sort of form thoughts, right? And don't be afraid to sort of say, you know what? Maybe in this one, all the boxes, the squares were circled black, you know, were filled in, right? We call that a figure ground, right? Where we see the figures and the ground is white and blank. And then to sort of change that and set the ground to be black and the figure to be white, to sort of invert that and start to understand what's empty space, what's form, what's mass, what's poche, right? What I mean by poche is the stuff that we fill in with ink, right? Or with fill, right? The sort of stuff when we cut through in a section or plan, it's the stuff that's filled in, it's mass, it's solid, okay? So you can always invert things to try to get a different reading on them, right? Diagram types, like the kinds of things, again, in deconstructivism, another form of postmodernism that Peter Eisenman did. He did a whole set of studies on isometrics, where he would start with something simple and then begin to play a set of rules with them. And in doing so, he would create this sort of interesting analyses, right? Where you start with a cube, you then turn it into a 9 square, you then start to subtract, you then start to subtract, add, subtract, analyze, turn different layers on and off, etc. Except this were all done by hand. Right. And then suddenly you can start to do more and more, right? So suddenly it's about the cube and the voxel and subtraction and carving. Then suddenly it's about planes, right? You start to get a buildup of planes. So in this case, the planes were the things that were intangible as cuts, you know, sort of defining masses that we could subtract. In here, the masses disappear, right? The actual cubes, and all we have are the edges, those planes, right? And we can start to begin to play around with the planes, then starting to add rotation, then thinking about, well, we have solids, we have planes, we could also think about lines or frames, right? And starting to do this sort of weird analysis where you start with one ingredient, you start to do a sequence with, you start another ingredient in a sequence with, another ingredient to start with a sequence with, and then is there a way to combine them, right? So that's something that he did a lot of under this sort of guise of deconstructivism, sort of thinking about sort of new language of architecture, not based necessarily on form or shelter, but on a set of rules, and following those rules, pedantic as they are, to the most logical conclusion, even if they don't necessarily make sense physically, right? So, you know, there was a time when we were questioning, you know, the sort of logic of modernism and the logic of the project of architecture that came before modernism. So, you know, of course, someone had to do weird for the sake of weird. That's the other sort of description of postmodernism, or POMO, right? Here again is that Yokohama master plan, which isn't necessarily a true master plan, but again, sort of looking at the city grid and then sort of mapping these weird sort of places, these corridors of activity and program, like eating, exhibiting, doing sports, entertaining, etc. Right? Sort of focusing on the verb. Didn't I just do this? Did I just go backwards? Oh, maybe I just had a couple of, sorry, it's weird when that happens. Yeah, okay, I was wondering why I repeated. Right, here's another set from Peter Eisenman where he's taking the grid and then starting to slowly crumple and fold the things, right? So don't be afraid to sort of take some of these lines. You know, I did a studio like that with fourth year with an architect here in town, Eric Strain, is a really good architect, probably the best one in the region. and in the Mojave Desert. And what we did is we had the students start to draw lines on the map as they were on the site. And these lines became lines of influence. Then you zoom in on a spot and you see where all these lines are. It's up for you to interpret them. Are they cuts in the landscape? Are they extrusions? Do they start to form closed shapes that you can begin to extrude? Are those roof forms? Are they depressions in the landscape as courtyards, right? You could always begin to think of them as operators. Are they folds, cuts, voids, frames, the outlines of massings, etc., right? So you could always begin to sort of experiment in that way. So there's lots of different ways architects try to get the creative juices in their heads going, right? Here's a simple set of diagrams you can see here based in section, right? So here's we'll just make 2 rooms. We'll extrude them up and we'll make one room smaller and one room larger. We'll make one room sort of go over the other one, right? And sort of nest them on top. Now we'll sort of finger them out, right? And sort of have them zigzag. Now we'll have one cantilever out into the other, right? Sort of looking at the section and then extruding that. So instead of looking at the plan, extruding it up, we're looking at the section and extruding it out, which I think is really interesting. And so parts of these become parts of the elevation. You can see the facade, the envelope, and parts of these become the sort of, interestingly, the sort of voids in a section, right? The sort of these sort of really interesting volumes on the inside, right? And you can see you get things that are, some ways impractical. But you get, let's say, a living room that and you get, a bedroom or something like that, so, and an outdoor patio, you get this sort of interesting spatial interlock, right? I would argue it's called a double house. So you have 2 houses, this one where all the sort of inside surfaces are toned with black, and then this one where everything's toned with white. Instead of just sort of doing 2 row houses, conventional row houses, you can start to have the same form on the outside, but then start to give some programmatic and spatial variation on the inside, right? At least I think that's how I read it, right? A house inside a house, alternating floors, so doing different variations, creating some outdoor space opportunities, right? And then the final result. So you can see a sort of progression in their thinking, right? And the moves they're making. They didn't just go from here to here. There were steps in between, right? To develop this. Here's an exploded axon, right? That's another type of diagram, right? So you could take this unit and then start to blow pieces of it away. We'll do that eventually with your planar compositions. We'll start to, pull them up and maybe push them out to the side in some ways, to talk about the various pieces of program, or how the different pieces of architecture, the planes and the thresholds sort of work, right? Here's another one. This was a temporary serpentine pavilion by Toyo Ito and Cecil Baumann. This was, I can't believe it's been 20 years. Went up in London. This is like the best one too. There's a logic here, the way the triangles are created, the sort of triangulation and the lines, but this is basically just welded steel and then glass. This was a big hit when it came out. And the engineer working with Toyo Ito is a Japanese architect. Cecil Baumann, I think maybe he's British, or I can't remember where he's from. Engineer. The Cecil Baumann, the engineer, is really interested in these sort of fractals, these patterns, these mathematical constructs to sort of generate things from a simple set of rules and simple set of parts and making something more complex out of them. So really interesting that, I keep hitting my arrows and that keeps sending things backwards. Sorry, I'll just use my mouse. Try to anyway. Here's another one. This was a plan for Philadelphia by Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn is a very famous architect in the 50s and 60s. He did the Salk Institute, which is in La Jolla, California, just north of San Diego. Very, very, very famous piece of architecture you can go see. Next time you're in Southern California, I recommend going to the Salk Institute. It's a set of laboratories in the concrete and teak wood that line courtyard that then looks out over a cliff of the Pacific Ocean, and it has a small strip of channel of water that then falls off the edge. It's really kind of quite lovely. And architecturally, it's a masterpiece in a number of different ways. Anyway, here he was just sort of making marks. And that's another way you can think about diagramming, right? You can think about just mark making, right? You don't have to revert to any kind of symbol, some, weird symbols like stars or anything else. You can just make marks. And then the dense buildup of lines or line work or marks begins to talk about, and the gradients you get begin to talk about how you're reading the activity, the energy on the site, right? Maybe it's, I've had students do that, right? Where we try to get them to things seen and unseen, right? So maybe it's about mapping noises, maybe it's about mapping the paths of bees and how they pollinate with the flowers. So they have to start looking at the vegetation around, start listening, etc. So, or start smelling, right? For different types of flora in there, what's blooming at the time. So, you can begin to think in terms of that. He didn't draw streets, he drew traffic. And by a set of logics, you can start to see corridors of car traffic, pedestrian traffic, sometimes when that's even diagonal through a square or a circle, right, in the city. Oh, I just hit my keyboard again. I went back to slide 3. That's really annoying. I don't know why it's doing that. Here's again, Paul Rudolph was late modernist, and then he also had a lot to do with brutalism. So if you look at a lot of brutal buildings, they were modeled off of some of the things Paul Rudolph was doing. He did the architecture building, School of Architecture at Yale, which is an example of a concrete brutalist building where they rake the concrete, so it has that corduroy effect and exposed aggregate, and it has even the sort of fashionable 60s 70s coloration of like orange and some olivey greens and some yellows, right? Very sort of like late Mad Men sort of aesthetic. So here he was diagramming the Barcelona Pavilion, which was a Mies van der Rohe early modernist project from the 1930s or 1920s, maybe even, I don't remember, but here he is diagramming like views and things like that through it, right? So he's trying to sort of understand how this thing works and how people move through it and what you can see from all the various vantage points. He was really trying to figure out, well, why did Mies end the plane right here, and why did he put another one here and it starts there and ends there? And so he was trying to sort of map people through it, and then what they could actually see based on certain directions, right? So trying to figure out where things are occluded by these planes and where you can actually see out through them. There's a pool and a courtyard out here, and the entrance is over here, etc. So, all right, I'll use my cursor again. But you can see it's a very simple drawing, and then instead of I would even argue you didn't need these arrowheads down here, but just a simple set of splines and a simple set of lines, right? And not much else is needed, honestly. I'm not sure why this one's so pixelated. Sorry about that. But these are a set of light studies like someone like Stephen Hall does, where he'll take the model and he'll actually get that lamp out and he'll start to take photographs. Here's using light and the absence of light, the contrast between dark, light, and dark, to great effect, right? To sort of look at how shadows and bright spots are being cast in the space, how those change over time. Stephen Hall, again, is another Pritzker Prize winner architect. The information diagram, yep. Here's mapping the curriculum for the Bauhaus by Walter Gropius. Let me turn my phone off, sorry. There's key times of the day where people discover my Instagram account, they just start liking things, and it's like shut up, phone. All right, here's another one talking about program and use, right? So what's the program of office, which by the way is changing rapidly again? What's the program of housing, which again is also, I mean, if there's anything we learned from the pandemic, where a lot of us were working from home, it's how much we figured out about our houses that we like and dislike, right? How well they worked in certain situations, how well they didn't work in certain situations. And some people are still work from home, right? Or at least part of the time. In fact, we are the summer. So yeah, anyway, we're thinking about the city, public infrastructure, what happens in there. Here's UN Studio. This was called the Mobius House. This is actually a three-dimensional construct, but unrolled into a sort of programmatic diagram section, right? Where you can sort of take this strip of a house and unroll it and then flatten it out and draw it. And so the idea was that, if you think about the daily cycle of work, each part of the house you move through, compensate, like, here's my sleeping, here's what I do after I wake up, here's what I do in the morning, here's what I do at midday, here's what I do in the afternoon, here's what I do before going to bed, and then back to sleeping, right? It's this idea of the sort of cycle being reflected in the shape and the organization and layout of a house. Cedric Price, very famous British architect, looking at the systems. So here we see basically a diagrammatic readout of a plan, right? This is a floor plan. We can see, for instance, egress stair. We can see program like cinema, auditorium, open air, 6-screen cinema, right? And then we see again how these panels can rotate and change. Kind of a weird diagram. This is a really famous example of a historical diagram from a book by Edward Tufte, who's an artist from MIT. He specializes in envisioning information. So his idea, this is where the sort of idea of data can be beautiful, sort of displayed. This was a map of Napoleon's Russian campaign, and the width of these paths are the width of the sort of the size of the army, right? And so you can see, so he's trying to get to Leningrad and then Moscow, right? The army gets smaller and smaller, parts of it split off to go off on other campaigns, but winter sets in. You can see there's a timeline here, right? And then suddenly when it has to retreat, and it's barely a trickle by the time it gets back, right? So there's a story within the story, right? There's the way the graphics are configured and drawn reinforce that story, right? So there's lots of meaning embedded in how the thing's drawn. The size of the army, geographical coordinates, along with dates, the direction the army was traveling. So here is pressing forward, and then the black is the retreat, right? And then the weather, temperature along the path, which you can see here, right? So really kind of an interesting way of sort of mapping these things, right? You can think about this, and there's lots of different ways people map things in urban spaces. This looks like the island of Manhattan again, and this looks like probably Brooklyn and parts of Queens, right? Over here, Brooklyn, Williamsburg, Queens, Long Island City, whatever. There's Central Park, just a few blue lines going through it. So they're looking at subways, taxis, walking buses. I don't know. They're looking at connectivity in some way with buses, let's say, versus subways and taxis. I'm not sure how to read this, but there's no actual outlines of the landmass. It's just the road grids, the street grids, right? But I can automatically, I mean, Manhattan, those sorts of cities, you can sort of tell what they are by the shapes, right? Another way of calling out information, right? Mapping information. You don't have to, they can be really simple, particularly if you have lots of information on here, and then lots of information starts to look really nice, right? But oftentimes you don't want something distracting, so you can simplify it. Maybe just black dots, right? Maybe black dots and occasional leaders, sort of giving some information. There are other ways of sort of displaying information that you might find in like, let's say, that Clark County report on demographics, right? Or a report by RTC on use of public transportation or whatever, right? So there's all kinds of different ways to sort of think about how to display graphics, display information graphically. Geometrically, of course, and architecturally, of course, but other ways as well. I'll just skip through this. Right, here's another story about, the disparity between what men make versus what women make. I mean, it tells you we're still talking about this, and this was from 1940. Boy, how many years ago was that? Like 80 years ago. Lots of different examples. So you can always look for diagramming examples. Pinterest is actually a fun place where you can go down a rabbit hole and never emerge, it seems like, for hours on time, or before you fall asleep and pass out for the night, where you can find lots of interesting examples of diagrams and drawings. Or, ideally, good diagrams are generative, right? They're not something you do at the end to sort of post-rationalize what you did. They're things that help you sort of think through the data and think what your responses are. And sometimes they even suggest lines, edges, and things like that for the architecture themselves, right? If you map them onto the actual site. Okay, so. Another example, right? Here's an exploded version of a site. Set of interventions. Here's the larger sort of regional map perspective, right? So you can start to see how these things might be composed together. That's just mapping, right? Here's mapping, but with the calendar, so you can sort of see a yearly or annual cycle. Here's a sort of sectional diagram, but in a quite literal way. So here you see water. Sometimes we cut through ground, sometimes we're cutting through water, right? Or ice in this case, right? This is ice fishing. Or maybe, it's interesting, we had Chris Cornelius from Studio Indigenous. He's the department chair at University of Mexico. But he draws sections, and he's really interesting guy, phenomenal at drawing. He draws sections and he draws them like really tall and starts to draw the sky and celestial events that are happening. It's really incredible. So you can begin to sort of talk about the things that really make you tick, right? As an individual, what are you thinking about? What do you notice when you're around your site, and how do you begin to express that, right? It might begin to talk about what you draw or what you map. It might begin to talk about how you map it or how you format your drawings, right? Or your diagrams. This is a section, but at the same time, it's talking about a whole number of, like, here's copper skin, the smokestack. So it's talking about the components, what these shapes are for, how they're clad, and what the outside materials are made out of. You see the silhouettes talking about programs, so we can see how they're being used, right? Somebody's sitting, somebody's standing, but basically fishing. Someone here fishing, you can start to see the relationship between the inside and the outside shapes, etc., right? So good drawings can show you a lot of things in one shot, okay? You can always start by making lots of things in one drawing. We can always split them out if it's not working. We need to sort of simplify, right? So getting information on there is important. We can always combine or pull apart and edit later, right? Zooming out, you can start to see more. This is a really famous example. This is from this was named the #1 building project, #1 piece of architecture from this decade. Seattle Public Library, also by Office of Metropolitan Architecture, obviously in Seattle. So this was the idea. What they did is they were presented what the program was as far as the librarians said. Librarians said, we deal with books and media, and not necessarily like with public space and all the sort of other stuff. Like, it needs to focus on books. So they said, okay, we'll color code all of the program, and we'll put all the sort of blue, the books, together. It's only 32%, and the rest of the program is 68%. 68% of your program is not books. So they said, look, librarians, we're not telling you you're wrong. We're just presenting the information, or giving this back to you and saying, you need to think about beyond the book, right? Like the sort of public program, the public program of library, particularly Carnegie libraries, right? It's a center of activity, a place where people can come, not only to sort of pick up books, but to share information. So all these things, meeting rooms, living room, mixers, staff places, of course, parking and all that other stuff, right? All this other stuff. They sort of broke it down. What they said is that there's certain things that we know will always be there, and there's certain things that we think will be there for a little while, but they'll change and shift. We don't know what those change and shift to. And so they put certain things in masses, the things that were like, we know we're going to have books, so we're going to put a big mass here. We know we're going to have this, we're going to put a big mass here. All this sort of program that was flexible and they couldn't possibly anticipate, they put on top and in between these masses. And they skinned the whole thing with a big glass diagrid. And so if you ever look at this Seattle Public Library, let me see. Here's the book stack, which is basically a parking garage. It looks like this, right? So you can see basically they took that diagram and they made a set of boxes program, and then inside on top and in between, right? You get all the sort of flexible spaces, right? That can change over time. That's what it looks like on the outside. It's quite literally the diagram in diagrid form. And what's interesting is that when they skinned it, the diagrid is actually doing double duty, right? So you typically, when you see a glass facade like that, it's a curtain wall, meaning that it's sort of clipped onto the structure, and it's really only structural in that it keeps itself from being pushed in, right? But the structure is on the inside, and this is just skin, right? There's bones on the inside, there's just skin hung on. This is actually partially structural as well, right? Diagrid gives you a two-way system to distribute loads. And so it's not just compensating for lateral loads and snow loads and wind loads and earthquake loads and seismic loads for itself, but it's also helping to sort of keep up parts of the building, right? So interestingly enough, sort of double duty, both facade or envelope and a little bit of structure. All right. So that's just to say, there's lots of, sorry, let me close that too. There's lots of different ways to think about diagrams, right? So look, between now and tomorrow, I encourage you, if anything, print out a map or two of downtown, or print this out of your model and have some pieces of paper and a pen and a sketchbook, and you can start to mark things on it. I really mean that, right? You could always bring a couple printouts of maps or something like that, where you can begin to sort of have these guides and to remember where things are located, right? Where people are lined up to get on to wait for the bus. Where, you can always look at like where tourists have been. You know why? Even in the morning time when there's no tourists there, it's where the pigeons are, because people drop food everywhere, right? And then suddenly there's pigeons, like the Las Vegas equivalent of New York City rats, right? You can observe, you can look really look hard. That would be my biggest piece of advice. Set yourself up for success when you're on your site always by having some information that you can start to notate with, right? Or notate onto, all right? Help question your assumptions, challenge maybe your preconceptions about the place a little bit too, right? Wear a shade. I mean, that's huge. Right now on Fremont Street or downtown, I'm thinking, the difference between me walking from Dina's site all the way up to Nate's site rather than calling an Uber, or, parking and then driving and parking again, is probably the temperature outside and how much shade is in between each, right? Because it's not that far, really. I mean, for a quick, excursion field trip, I mean, I've led field trips everywhere. So, I mean, we'd walk like 10 miles a day and uphill, downhill, whatever, right? But when it's 100 degrees or 90 in the 90s, we can rethink that. But, to me, I think that's really important. Those things, walkability, right? What feeds into walkability, right? There's a lot of inertia around the automobile in Las Vegas and parking, right? And the public realm working for the automobile, not necessarily for humans, right? So in order to counter that, you really have to think about it and you have to be adamant about it, right? I think cities should work for humans, not the other way around. I think cars should work for us, not the other way around, right? So, to me, I think it's vital for Las Vegas is gonna grow. At a certain point, we can't just keep growing outwards, right? Like we run up against Air Force bases and national parks and mountain ranges, right? No matter how much they want to stretch along the 15 corridor up down to Jean everywhere else. So we need to start to think about how to build up, how to infill, and then how to build upwards and densify a little bit here and there in a smart way, not just density for density's sake, but thinking about our urban core becoming more and more urban, right? At a time where a lot of people want to, if they can afford it, want to live in an urban setting. You know what I mean? So, okay. So if you have things like this, or just the Rhino model, but screen capture, and you printed out a couple of versions of it, have those so you can start to mark things on them, right? I mean it. It'll really be helpful when it comes to mapping. Zoom in on that Google Maps so you get your block and then the immediate blocks around it, sort of a 9 square 3x3 grid of blocks or something. Print that out, a couple of copies of that, and you can start to mark on it. Do what you need to do, what you think will be helpful for you. Okay. You can always come back into the digital version and start to place things in and make it beautiful or whatever. But I don't discount simple tech, low tech, simplest piece of technology, pencil and paper, right? Like with the inclined plane and the lever and a wheel and a pencil, which is just a
Quick
lever.
question. Are you able to include that diagram PDF in the module for today? Just,
Yeah, I'll upload it to Canvas. Yeah.
it'd be great. Thank you.
Yep, sure will. In fact, I can do that right now while I'm thinking about it. Do I have Canvas up? No. There we go. I logged in earlier, so it shouldn't challenge me for another 8 hours or whatever. No, maybe it will. Maybe I have to multi-factor authentication it again. Who knows? I mean, I guess it's a good thing that people can't hack your Canvas. I don't know what the end game of that would actually be. Haha, I can see your syllabus. I don't know, whatever. But yes, let me just add this. I'll also upload the video that we're recording right now to it. So I'll say site diagramming 01. Oh, and also add today's date. What's the 13th of June? Publish that. Where to go? Okay. What's this? Oh gosh, I don't know what's going on. Oh, okay. Ugh, those are really bright colors. Please don't use that many bright colors together. Where did it go? Diagrams. PDF. Search and finder, I guess. Sorry. I don't know where it went, but let's see. How many PDFs have diagram in them? Come on, really? Open recent. Info diagrams. Fall 2016. Well, that was a long time ago. Properties. Where is this located? Yikes. Oh, it's in downloads. Sorry. Insert media upload. Yeah, I'll just upload. Downloads. Seriously, just what other questions you guys have for before tomorrow? Anything?
Outside of just making sure we print maps of our site and the printout so that we could take notes on the trip, right?
Yeah, make
was
sure you
that-
have something to bring photos to. You want to take
Okay.
some photographs. Yeah, for a smartphone or camera. Document, upload document. What the heck? Why was that so difficult? Okay, sorry. Ay, ay, ay. Okay, no preview available. Don't care. Save. All right. So I'm going to stop recording. Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, we have about an hour, a little less than an hour left. I would say just get to work. I'm going to stick around as long as you guys are around. If you guys have any questions or need any help with anything, troubleshooting stuff. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn off the recording.